Megan Bryant had always been known for her love of flowers. A skilled florist and a single mother, her passion extended far beyond her small flower shop in the heart of town. Her front yard had become her masterpiece, a sprawling garden filled with vibrant blooms, rare plants, and meticulously arranged flower beds. For Megan, this wasn't just a hobby, it was an expression of her creativity and a way to bring a little beauty to the world. The garden wasn't just for her either. Neighbors often stopped by to compliment her work, sometimes asking for gardening tips or even taking small photos to share with their families. Children from the neighborhood would pass by after school, marveling at the butterfly bushes that seemed to come alive with color. Megan's garden wasn't just a collection of plants, it was an experience. She had carefully designed it to attract rare species of butterflies and birds, creating a living, breathing ecosystem that felt magical to anyone who visited. Her favorite feature was the evening lighting she had installed, which subtly highlighted the soft hues of her flowers at night, giving the garden an ethereal glow. It became a place of peace for Megan, a space where she could sit with a cup of tea after a long day and feel the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. For her teenage son, Alex, it was a source of quiet pride, even if he didn't always say it aloud. He often teased her about being the flower queen, but deep down, he loved the fact that their home stood out for something so beautiful. But not everyone saw the garden the way Megan and her supporters did. A few neighbors viewed it as a disruption. Among them was Henry Brown, a stern, middle-aged man with a reputation for having the most immaculate lawn in the neighborhood. His grass was always perfectly trimmed, his hedges aligned with mathematical precision. To Henry, the sight of Megan's vibrant, unruly blooms was chaos. He didn't care for the eclectic mix of colors, or the way her garden didn't follow the rigid symmetry he so valued. It didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood, at least not as he envisioned it. Henry wasn't the type to confront Megan directly, but over time she started noticing little things: her garbage bins being moved, passive-aggressive comments muttered as she worked outside, and even a few pointed remarks at community meetings about keeping properties uniform. Despite these small annoyances, Megan paid no mind. She had no reason to believe it was anything serious. After all, for every critical voice, there were countless others who loved what she had created. One of her neighbors, an elderly woman named Carol, often told her that the garden was her favorite thing about the neighborhood. "You bring life to this street," Carol would say with a warm smile. Even younger families appreciated it. Some parents joked that Megan's garden was the closest thing their kids had to a nature lesson outside of school. Megan couldn't imagine that something so positive could become a problem. That sense of peace shattered one sunny afternoon when a thick envelope arrived in the mail. Megan had just finished pruning her roses when Alex handed it to her, saying, "It's from the community board. Looks important." Megan opened the letter casually, expecting it to be some routine update or announcement about a neighborhood event. Instead, her heart sank as she read the contents. The letter wasn't a friendly notice, it was a fine. A $60,000 fine. The words stared back at her in bold-type violation of community appearance standards. According to the letter, her garden had been deemed a breach of the community's uniform aesthetic guidelines. It claimed that her choice of plants, her custom lighting, and even the layout of her flower beds were in violation of neighborhood rules. Megan was stunned. She had never received any prior warnings or complaints about her garden. No emails, no letters, no phone calls. The fine felt excessive, almost absurd, like someone had gone out of their way to make her life difficult. Confused and angry, Megan reread the letter several times, trying to make sense of it. It referenced vague guidelines about maintaining visual harmony within the community, but nothing specific enough to justify such a massive fine. What's more, it accused her of refusing to comply with multiple notices to remove her garden, notices she had never seen or heard about. She called the number provided on the letter, but the person on the other end offered no clear explanation. "You'll need to take this up at the next meeting," they said dismissively before hanging up. Megan's hands trembled as she placed the letter down on the kitchen table. Alex sat across from her, looking equally confused. "What does this even mean?" he asked, glancing at the paper. Megan shook her head. "It means someone doesn't like the garden and wants to get rid of it. But $60,000? That's ridiculous." It's got to be a mistake still. A sinking feeling in her stomach told her otherwise. She thought of Henry Brown and the way he had always seemed to glare at her garden with disdain. Was this his doing? Had he been complaining about her all this time? Determined to find out, Megan decided to attend the next community meeting. She wasn't the type to back down from a fight, especially not when it came to something she had poured so much love and effort into. But as the days passed, she noticed something strange happening. The warm smiles from neighbors like Carol became more reserved. People who used to wave at her from their driveways now avoided eye contact. Even the children who used to admire her flowers seemed reluctant to come near her yard. It was as if an invisible wall had gone up between her and the rest of the community. The change was subtle but undeniable. When the day of the meeting arrived, Megan walked into the community center with her head held high. The room was already full, with neighbors seated in neat rows, their murmurs filling the air. At the front of the room sat the board members, including Henry Brown, who offered her a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. Megan clenched her fists, determined not to let her frustration show. She was here to defend her garden, to defend her home, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. Megan sat silently in the community center, gripping the envelope containing the $60,000 fine as though it were a lifeline. The room buzzed with muted chatter, her neighbors exchanging glances in her direction. It was a strange mix of curiosity, pity, and from certain individuals like Henry Brown, satisfaction. She couldn't help but feel the weight of their judgment. It was as if she had been put on trial, even before the meeting began. Her garden, the project that had brought her so much joy, was suddenly the target of scorn, and she couldn't understand why. What was it about her flowers, her lighting, her design, that had sparked such hostility? The meeting was called to order with a sharp bang of the gavel. The chairperson, Linda Cartwright, adjusted her glasses and scanned the room. Linda had always struck Megan as a no-nonsense figure, someone who prided herself on efficiency and order. But there was something cold in her demeanor tonight, something that made Megan uneasy. "We'll begin with item 1 on the agenda," Linda said briskly. The discussion of Property 14 billion and its non-compliance with community standards. Megan froze. That was her address. "Miss Bryant, if you'd like to address the board," Linda continued, gesturing to an empty podium at the front of the room. Megan swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand. The murmurs quieted as all eyes fell on her. Clutching the fine notice in one hand, she approached the podium and took a deep breath. "I received this letter last week," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "It says I've been fined $60,000 for violating community standards. But I was never given any prior notice, no warnings, no chance to address these supposed issues. I don't even understand what I've done wrong." Henry Brown, seated among the board members, leaned forward with a smirk that made Megan's blood boil. "Miss Bryant," Linda said, cutting through the tension, "as a resident of this community, you're required to adhere to the aesthetic guidelines laid out in the bylaws. Your garden, while creative, does not align with those guidelines." "What guidelines?" Megan demanded. "I've read the bylaws and they're vague at best. There's nothing in them that explicitly bans what I've done." Linda pursed her lips. "The bylaws allow for interpretation by the board. We've determined that your garden disrupts the visual harmony of the neighborhood." "Disrupts the harmony," Megan echoed, incredulous. "My garden brings people joy. It's not an eyesore. If anything, it's the opposite." Henry cleared his throat, drawing attention to himself. "With all due respect, Miss Bryant, this isn't about what you think looks good. It's about maintaining consistency across the community. Your garden, while I'm sure very well-intentioned, draws too much attention. It's distracting." Distracting, Megan's voice rose slightly, but she caught herself. The last thing she wanted was to come across as emotional or defensive. "Henry, do you realize how ridiculous that sounds? You're fining me $60,000 because my garden is distracting." Another board member, a younger man named Stephen, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's not just about distraction," he said, avoiding her gaze. "There's also the matter of compliance with lighting regulations. Your garden lights operate past the designated curfew." Megan frowned. I use soft, solar-powered lights to highlight my flowers. They're not intrusive. No one's ever complained to me about them. Complaints were filed, Linda interjected, her tone firm. Several neighbors expressed concerns about the lights, as well as the overall impact of your garden on property values. Megan's stomach twisted. Property values? Are you serious? My garden doesn't hurt anyone's property values. If anything, it makes the street more attractive. Henry leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. That's not for you to decide. For a moment, Megan was at a loss for words. The fine wasn't just about her garden, it was about control. They wanted to dictate how she could use her own front yard, as though her creativity and individuality were somehow a threat to the neighborhood's conformity. But she wasn't about to back down. If someone had a problem with my garden, they could have come to me directly, she said, her voice calm but resolute. I would have listened. But instead, I get hit with this outrageous fine with no warning and no explanation until now. How is that fair? Fairness isn't the issue here, Linda replied coolly. The issue is compliance. Megan tightened her grip on the podium, her knuckles white. Then I'd like to see the specific rules I've violated. Show me exactly where it says my garden breaks the bylaws. There was a pause. Linda exchanged a glance with Henry, who gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. We'll provide you with the relevant documentation, Linda said finally, but you'll need to take immediate steps to bring your property into compliance. What does that even mean? Megan shot back. Am I supposed to tear out my entire garden? That would be a start, Henry said, his tone dripping with condescension. The room buzzed with whispers. Megan turned to face the audience, scanning the sea of faces. Some looked away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Others stared at her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to irritation. Carol, her elderly neighbor, sat in the back row, her lips pressed into a thin line. Megan had hoped for more support, but it was clear that fear of the board, or perhaps fear of standing out, kept most of her neighbors silent. Taking a deep breath, Megan returned her gaze to the board. I'm not tearing out my garden, she said firmly, and I'm not paying this fine. I'll fight it. Linda arched an eyebrow. You're welcome to contest the fine, Miss Bryant. But I should warn you, the board has full authority to enforce community standards. If you refuse to comply, we may escalate the matter to legal proceedings. Megan felt a chill run down her spine. Legal proceedings? Over flowers? The absurdity of it all made her want to laugh, but she knew this was no joke. They were serious. This wasn't just about her garden anymore, it was about her rights as a homeowner. If they could do this to her, they could do it to anyone. I understand, Megan said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. I'll see you in court. With that, she stepped away from the podium and walked out of the community center, her head held high. But as soon as she was outside, the weight of what had just happened hit her like a tidal wave. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone to call her lawyer. They're threatening legal action now, she said, her voice tight with emotion. I need to know what my options are. Her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel, listened patiently as Megan recounted the meeting. This sounds like a classic case of selective enforcement, Rachel said. They're targeting you because your garden doesn't fit their arbitrary standards. But don't worry, we'll fight this. Megan exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing just slightly. She wasn't alone in this. Rachel would help her navigate the legal maze ahead. Still, the fight was just beginning, and Megan knew it wouldn't be easy. The board had made one thing clear: they weren't going to back down. But neither was she. This was her home, her garden, her life, and she wasn't about to let them take it from her. Megan woke up the next morning with a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. The events of the community meeting played over and over in her mind like a bad dream. The way Henry smirked as if he'd already won, the cold tone of Linda's warnings, and the silence from her neighbors, all of it felt heavy and oppressive. Her garden, the one thing that had brought her peace and purpose, now felt like a target painted on her home. But Megan wasn't someone who gave up easily. If the board thought they could intimidate her into compliance, they were wrong. She had already called her lawyer, Rachel, and started planning her next steps. That morning, Megan went outside to tend to her garden, hoping that caring for the plants would help clear her head. But the sight that greeted her made her heart drop. Several of her flower beds had been vandalized overnight. Stems were snapped, petals scattered across the ground, and her carefully arranged solar lights were smashed, their glass shards glittering in the sunlight. It was a deliberate act. This wasn't some random accident. Someone had come onto her property and destroyed her work. Megan's hands trembled as she crouched down to pick up the broken pieces. Who could have done this? Her mind immediately went to Henry, but she had no proof. It could have been anyone. The silent neighbors? The board? Even some stranger who saw her garden as an easy target after the meeting? She felt a mix of anger and vulnerability. This wasn't just about flowers anymore, this was about her home being violated. Determined not to let this slide, Megan called the local police. An officer arrived within the hour, a middle-aged man with a weary expression that suggested he'd seen too many minor neighborhood disputes. He walked around the garden with her, taking photos and jotting down notes on a clipboard. "It's clear this was intentional," he said, pointing to the trampled plants. "Do you have any security cameras?" Megan shook her head. "No, I've never needed them before. This has always been a quiet neighborhood." The officer nodded but didn't seem optimistic. "Without any footage or witnesses, it's going to be hard to figure out who did this. I can file a report, but unless we get more evidence, there's not much else we can do." Megan clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. It felt like the board or whoever was behind this knew exactly how to push her buttons. They weren't just finding her, they were trying to wear her down, to make her feel helpless. But she refused to give them the satisfaction. After the officer left, Megan called Rachel to update her. "They trashed my garden," she said, pacing back and forth in her kitchen. "The police can't do anything without proof, so I'm going to install cameras. This won't happen again." Rachel's voice was calm but firm. "That's a smart move. But Megan, this might not stop with vandalism. These kinds of disputes can escalate quickly. Be prepared for more pressure from the board. They're likely testing your limits." Rachel's words stayed with Megan as she went about her day. She visited a local hardware store and bought several security cameras, spending the rest of the afternoon setting them up around her property. The cameras weren't fancy, but they covered the garden, her driveway, and the side entrance to her backyard. She made sure to angle them discreetly, not wanting to provoke anyone further but ensuring they would catch any future trespassers. The next few days passed quietly, but the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Megan noticed that fewer people waved as they drove by. Even Carol, who had always been so kind, avoided eye contact when Megan walked out to get her mail. It was as if the whole street had turned against her overnight. Megan tried not to let it get to her, but the isolation weighed heavily on her. Then, late one night, the cameras paid off. Megan was woken by a notification on her phone, a motion alert from the garden camera. Her heart raced as she opened the app and saw the live feed. There, in the dim glow of her garden lights, was Henry Brown. He was crouched near her flower beds, holding what looked like a small garden spade. Megan's first instinct was to storm outside and confront him, but she forced herself to think rationally. If she scared him off, he could deny everything. Instead, she stayed inside and recorded the live feed on her phone, capturing every movement he made. Henry dug up several plants, tossing them carelessly to the side before disappearing into the night. The next morning, Megan forwarded the footage to Rachel and called the police again. This time, the officer took her report more seriously. "This is solid evidence," he said, watching the video. "We'll follow up with him and see what he has to say." That afternoon, 2 officers arrived at Henry's house, and Megan watched from her window as they spoke to him on his porch. Henry's body language was defensive, arms crossed, head shaking, but after a few minutes, he stepped inside and returned with a potted plant. Megan's plant. The officers brought the plant back to her and confirmed that Henry had admitted to removing it from her garden. "He claims he was trying to clean up the neighborhood," one of the officers said, clearly unimpressed by the excuse. "We've given him a formal warning. If he steps onto your property again, it'll be trespassing." Megan thanked the officers but felt no sense of relief. A warning wasn't enough. Henry had vandalized her garden, and now he was hiding behind the excuse of community improvement. It was infuriating. When she told Rachel about the outcome, her lawyer was equally frustrated. They're treating this like a petty dispute, but it's more than that, Rachel said. This is harassment. We need to document everything, every incident, every interaction. If this goes to court, we'll need a strong case. Megan nodded, already feeling the weight of the fight ahead. Over the next week, she kept her phone close at all times, ready to capture anything unusual. The cameras caught a few more minor incidents: trash bags thrown into her yard, footprints in her flower beds, but nothing as blatant as Henry's late-night raid. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, slipped into her mailbox without a stamp. Megan opened it cautiously, half expecting another fine notice. Instead, it was a typed message on plain paper, unsigned. Stop fighting. Remove the garden. You don't belong here. The words sent a chill down her spine. Whoever had written it wasn't just trying to enforce community rules, they wanted her gone. Megan showed the letter to Rachel, who immediately contacted the police. This is a threat, Rachel said. We're not letting this slide. But when the police arrived, they were dismissive. It's probably just a prank, one officer said. Hard to prove who sent it without fingerprints or a witness. Megan felt like she was hitting a wall. No matter how much evidence she collected, the authorities seemed reluctant to take her seriously. Meanwhile, the board continued to pressure her, sending follow-up notices demanding payment of the fine. Despite everything, Megan refused to back down. She began researching similar cases online, reading about homeowners who had successfully fought back against unjust fines and harassment. She reached out to a local gardening organization, hoping to find support from people who understood the value of her work. It was exhausting, but Megan knew she couldn't stop. This wasn't just about her garden anymore, it was about standing up for her rights as a homeowner. And if the board thought they could scare her into submission, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Megan sat at her dining table late into the night, staring at the stack of papers spread out before her. Between the fine notices, the threats, and the police reports, her once orderly life had spiraled into chaos. Her garden, the source of so much beauty and pride, had become a battleground, and Megan was determined to fight. But as she flipped through the HOA's bylaws and correspondence from the board, she realized how much the deck was stacked against her. The rules were written in such vague language that they could be twisted to mean whatever the board wanted. Visual harmony community standards approved landscaping, it all seemed subjective, designed to keep homeowners like her powerless. The next morning, Megan met with Rachel at her downtown office. Rachel, ever composed and professional, listened carefully as Megan recounted the latest incidents. When Megan showed her the unsigned threat letter, Rachel's face hardened. This changes things, she said. It's no longer just about the fine or the vandalism. Whoever sent this wants to intimidate you into submission. We're dealing with harassment, plain and simple. Rachel had already started filing a formal appeal against the fine, but the process was slow. The board had 30 days to respond, and Megan knew they would drag their feet. In the meantime, Rachel suggested a new strategy, bringing in outside experts to evaluate Megan's garden. If we can prove that your garden has real value, cultural, ecological, even financial, it'll strengthen our case, Rachel explained. The idea gave Megan a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few days, she contacted a local horticulturist, a landscape architect, and even an environmental scientist who specialized in urban ecosystems. Each expert visited her home, examining the garden with a mix of awe and professional curiosity. The horticulturist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patel, was particularly impressed. You've created a microhabitat here, she said, kneeling to inspect a cluster of wildflowers. These plants support pollinators that are critical to the local ecosystem. It's rare to see this level of biodiversity in a residential area. The landscape architect, meanwhile, focused on the garden's design. Your layout isn't just beautiful, it's functional, he said, gesturing to the winding stone paths and strategically placed flower beds. This could easily be considered a work of art. Honestly, it's a shame more neighborhoods don't encourage projects like this. Megan felt a flicker of pride at their words, but the constant stress of the conflict weighed heavily on her. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the eyes of her neighbors on her. Some of them had started avoiding her entirely, while others made no effort to hide their disapproval. Henry Brown, in particular, seemed to take every opportunity to remind her of his disdain. One afternoon, as Megan was watering her plants, Henry walked by and muttered loudly enough for her to hear, "Should have stuck to grass like everyone else." Megan clenched her jaw but said nothing. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. As the days passed, Rachel compiled the reports from the experts into a detailed presentation, complete with photographs and testimonials. The goal was to present this evidence to the board at the next meeting, forcing them to confront the reality that Megan's garden wasn't just compliant, it was an asset to the community. But Rachel warned Megan to be prepared for pushback. "They're not going to admit they were wrong easily," she said. "We need to stay one step ahead of them." Sure enough, the board's response came in the form of a new letter, this one claiming that Megan's garden posed a potential safety hazard. The letter cited concerns about the height of her plants obstructing visibility and her lighting causing unnecessary glare at night. Megan stared at the letter in disbelief. It was obvious that the board was grasping at straws, but the accusations were serious enough to warrant another police visit. This time, the officer who arrived seemed genuinely sympathetic. He walked through the garden with Megan, shaking his head at the claims. "I don't see how any of this is a safety issue," he said. "Your plants aren't blocking anything, and those lights are barely noticeable. Honestly, it looks like someone's trying to make your life difficult." "You're not wrong," Megan said bitterly. "But how do I prove it?" The officer shrugged. "Keep documenting everything. If it goes to court, you'll want as much evidence as possible." Despite the officer's reassurance, Megan felt her frustration mounting. The board wasn't just trying to fine her, they were building a case against her, piece by piece. Every new accusation, every false claim, was another brick in the wall they were constructing to box her in. But Megan wasn't about to let them win. A breakthrough came when one of Megan's neighbors, a young mother named Lisa, knocked on her door late one evening. Lisa had always been friendly but quiet, never getting involved in neighborhood politics. That night she seemed nervous, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being seen. "I heard about what's been happening with your garden," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you should see this." Lisa handed Megan a folder containing copies of emails between board members. Megan's heart raced as she scanned the pages. The emails were damning. They discussed strategies for enforcing fines, targeting specific homeowners, and using vague bylaws to push people into compliance. One email, written by Henry Brown himself, explicitly mentioned Megan's garden. "If we can't fine her into submission, we'll find another way to make her life miserable." "Where did you get these?" Megan asked, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Lisa hesitated. "My husband used to work with one of the board members. He still has access to their shared drive. I couldn't just sit by and watch this happen to you." Megan thanked Lisa profusely, knowing how much risk she had taken by coming forward. With this new evidence in hand, Megan felt a renewed sense of hope. She immediately forwarded the emails to Rachel, who was equally stunned. "This is exactly what we needed," Rachel said. "It proves that they're acting in bad faith. We're going to use this to turn the tables on them." At the next board meeting, Megan and Rachel arrived armed with their evidence. The room was packed, with neighbors crowding the seats and spilling into the hallway. The tension was palpable as Rachel took the floor, presenting the expert reports and emails in a calm, methodical manner. She didn't just defend Megan's garden, she exposed the board's tactics for everyone to see. Henry's face turned beet red as Rachel read aloud his email about making her life miserable. Linda Cartwright, the chairperson, tried to regain control, but it was clear that the damage had been done. The murmurs from the audience grew louder, and Megan saw several neighbors shaking their heads in disapproval. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt the tide starting to turn in her favor. By the end of the meeting, the board was forced to agree to a formal investigation into their practices. While the battle was far from over, Megan left the community center that night feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The board had spent months trying to break her, but she had stood her ground, and now, for the first time, she saw a path to victory. Megan had hoped that exposing the board's underhanded tactics during the last meeting would finally put an end to the madness. But if anything, the situation only escalated. The investigation Rachel had forced upon the board made them even more desperate. They couldn't risk losing their grip on the neighborhood or letting their dirty laundry be aired publicly. Megan wasn't dealing with a group that would quietly retreat. She was dealing with people who would fight tooth and nail to maintain their authority. And now, they had their sights set squarely on her. The first signs of retaliation came subtly, almost innocuously. Notices began arriving in Megan's mailbox almost daily, each citing increasingly ridiculous violations. One claimed that the rain barrels Megan used to collect water for her garden were unsightly and needed to be removed. Another alleged that her driveway was overdue for repaving, even though it was in perfect condition. One notice even accused her of improperly storing her garbage bins, despite the fact that she had kept them in the same spot for years. It was as if the board had decided to bury her in paperwork, hoping she'd drown in the sheer volume of petty complaints. Megan ignored most of these notices, forwarding them to Rachel for documentation. But the harassment wasn't limited to letters. One morning, as Megan stepped outside to tend to her garden, she found a small pile of dead plants dumped near her driveway. The plants were wilted and brown, clearly uprooted from someone's yard. It felt like a message, though Megan couldn't figure out what it meant. Later that evening, she discovered that someone had spray-painted a crude X on the back of her mailbox. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't random. Rachel was furious when Megan told her about the incidents. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said. "This is classic harassment. We can add it to the case, but I need you to be careful. These people are escalating, and that's never a good sign." Megan took Rachel's warning seriously. She installed additional security cameras, this time covering every angle of her property. She also began keeping a journal, meticulously documenting every incident, no matter how small. Every misplaced object, every piece of trash thrown into her yard, it all went into the journal, alongside timestamps and photos. But Megan's resolve was tested when the harassment began to affect her son, Alex. One afternoon, Alex came home from school looking upset. When Megan pressed him, he admitted that some of the neighborhood kids had been teasing him. "They said we're ruining the neighborhood," Alex mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. "One of them said their dad called you a troublemaker." Megan's heart sank. She had tried so hard to shield Alex from the worst of it, but it was clear that the conflict was seeping into every part of their lives. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a hug. "This isn't your fault. None of it is." That night, Megan stayed up late, her mind racing. The board wasn't just targeting her, they were isolating her family. They wanted to make her feel alone, powerless, and unwelcome. But Megan wasn't about to let them win. If anything, their tactics only strengthened her resolve. The next major escalation came in the form of a surprise inspection. Early one morning, Megan was startled by the sound of heavy machinery outside her house. When she looked out the window, she saw a crew of workers tearing up the sidewalk in front of her property. A man in a reflective vest knocked on her door and informed her that the sidewalk needed immediate repairs due to safety concerns. But the sidewalk was fine yesterday, Megan argued, standing on her porch in disbelief. The man shrugged. "We're just following orders from the neighborhood association," he said. Megan watched helplessly as the workers tore up the concrete, leaving a jagged, uneven mess behind. When they finally left, they taped off the area with bright orange caution tape, making her property look like a construction zone. The timing wasn't lost on Megan. This was clearly another tactic to wear her down. Later that week, Megan received a letter stating that she would be fined if the sidewalk wasn't repaired within 14 days. The audacity of it was almost laughable. "They destroy it, and now they expect me to fix it," Megan said, shaking her head as she handed the letter to Rachel. Rachel frowned as she read the notice. "This is more than harassment," she said. "They're trying to force you out. If they can make your property look bad enough, they can justify escalating the fine or even starting legal proceedings to seize the property." The words hit Megan like a punch to the gut. She had heard of similar stories, people losing their homes over petty disputes with HOA boards that abused their power. She refused to let that happen to her. Meanwhile, Rachel continued digging into the board's finances and connections, looking for anything that could be used against them. What she uncovered was shocking. It turned out that several board members, including Henry Brown, had financial ties to a landscaping company that frequently won contracts in the neighborhood. The company specialized in beautification projects that often involved tearing up existing gardens and replacing them with generic landscaping. The more violations the board issued, the more work the landscaping company received, and the more money flowed into the pockets of the board members. Rachel presented this information to Megan with a grim smile. "We've got them," she said. "This is a clear conflict of interest. If we can prove that they've been issuing fines to line their own pockets, they're finished." Armed with this new evidence, Rachel filed an additional complaint against the board, accusing them of fraud and abuse of power. But before the complaint could even make it to court, the board struck back with their most aggressive move yet. One evening, as Megan was preparing dinner, there was a loud knock at the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by a man in a suit holding a clipboard. "Miss Bryant, I'm here on behalf of the Neighborhood Association," he said. "We've received reports of code violations on your property. I'll need to conduct an inspection." Megan's stomach twisted. "You can't just show up unannounced," she said. The man gave her a cold smile. "I have the authority to inspect any property within the association's jurisdiction," he said, stepping past her without waiting for permission. Megan followed him as he walked through her yard, making notes on his clipboard and taking photos. He lingered in her garden, pointing out imaginary problems with the plants and lighting. When he finally left, he handed Megan a new notice, a list of supposed violations, each accompanied by a hefty fine. Megan's hands shook as she read the notice. It was clear that the board was escalating their efforts to break her. But instead of feeling defeated, Megan felt a spark of determination. They were throwing everything they had at her, but she wasn't backing down. That night, she and Rachel went over the evidence they had collected so far. The expert reports, the emails, the financial ties to the landscaping company, it was all coming together. "They've pushed too far," Rachel said. "We're going to expose them, Megan. And when we're done, they'll regret ever coming after you." Megan nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. The board had tried to intimidate her, isolate her, and even ruin her property. But they had underestimated her. This wasn't just about her garden anymore. It was about standing up to corruption and proving that they couldn't bully her into submission. And Megan was ready to fight. The courtroom was silent as Megan sat at the plaintiff's table, her heart pounding in her chest. Across the room, the board members sat stiffly, their expressions carefully neutral, but their unease evident. Henry Brown, seated at the center of the defense table, occasionally shot Megan a glare that betrayed his growing frustration. Rachel sat beside Megan, her presence a steadying force. Over the past few months, they had meticulously built their case, gathering every piece of evidence to expose the corruption and harassment Megan had endured. Now it was time to present it all before the judge. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing, called the court to order. Rachel wasted no time, launching into her opening statement with calm confidence. She described how the board had systematically targeted Megan, using vague bylaws and fabricated violations to impose exorbitant fines. She detailed the retaliatory tactics, vandalism, bogus inspections, and false complaints, all designed to intimidate Megan into submission. Finally, Rachel unveiled the most damning evidence: the financial ties between the board members and the landscaping company, which stood to profit from Megan's removal. As Rachel spoke, Megan could see the cracks beginning to form in the board's composure. Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Linda Cartwright, the chairperson, avoided eye contact altogether. They knew the evidence was damning, and there was no easy way to explain it away. The first piece of evidence Rachel presented was the series of expert reports Megan had commissioned. The horticulturist, Dr. Patel, took the stand and testified about the ecological value of Megan's garden. "This isn't just a collection of flowers," Dr. Patel explained. "It's a carefully designed habitat that supports local wildlife and promotes biodiversity. Removing it would be a loss not just to Miss Bryant but to the entire neighborhood." Next, the landscape architect detailed the garden's aesthetic and functional design, emphasizing how it enhanced the property and the surrounding area. Far from being an eyesore, this garden is an example of sustainable and creative landscaping, he said. It raises the standard for the community, not the other way around. The turning point came when Rachel introduced the emails Megan had received from Lisa, her neighbor. The court projector displayed the messages for everyone to see, including the incriminating line from Henry, "If we can't find her into submission, we'll find another way to make her life miserable." Rachel took her time reading it aloud, letting the words hang in the air. Henry's lawyer immediately objected, arguing that the emails were taken out of context. But Rachel was ready. She called Lisa to the stand, and the young mother testified about how she had come into possession of the emails and why she felt compelled to share them. "I couldn't stand by and watch them bully Megan," Lisa said, her voice steady. "What they were doing wasn't right, and it wasn't fair." The defense's attempts to discredit Lisa fell flat. She came across as honest and sincere, and her testimony only added weight to the evidence. The board's lawyer tried to shift focus, arguing that Megan had repeatedly violated the community's guidelines and that the fines were justified. But when pressed to provide concrete examples, the defense stumbled. Rachel pounced on their hesitation, using cross-examination to reveal the board's inconsistency. "Isn't it true," Rachel asked Linda Cartwright, "that the landscaping company you contracted for the neighborhood beautification projects is partially owned by your brother-in-law?" Linda's face flushed red. "I don't see how that's relevant," she stammered. "It's relevant because your financial ties to the company directly undermine your ability to enforce the community guidelines fairly," Rachel shot back. "And isn't it also true that this same company submitted a proposal to remove Miss Bryant's garden and replace it with standard turf landscaping?" Linda's silence was deafening. The final blow came when Rachel presented the financial records she had obtained during discovery. The records showed a suspicious pattern fines issued by the board often coincided with contracts awarded to the landscaping company. The amounts were too consistent to be a coincidence. Rachel connected the dots for the court, painting a clear picture of corruption and greed. By the time Rachel finished, the board's defense was in shambles. Henry looked ready to explode, and Linda seemed on the verge of tears. The judge called for a brief recess, and Megan stepped outside with Rachel to catch her breath. "You're doing great," Rachel said, placing a reassuring hand on Megan's shoulder. "They're running out of excuses. Just a little longer." When the court reconvened, the judge wasted no time delivering her verdict. She ruled in Megan's favor, declaring the $60,000 fine void and ordering the board to cease all harassment. Furthermore, the judge mandated an independent audit of the board's financial dealings, with a focus on their relationship with the landscaping company. But the biggest victory came in the form of damages. The judge awarded Megan $400,000 for the emotional distress and financial strain caused by the board's actions. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the figure was announced, and Megan felt a wave of relief wash over her. Justice had been served. As the court adjourned, Megan turned to Rachel, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Rachel smiled. "You fought for this, Megan. You earned it." Outside the courthouse, reporters and onlookers gathered, eager to hear Megan's story. But she wasn't interested in the spotlight. All she wanted was to go home, tend to her garden, and finally enjoy the peace she had fought so hard to protect. As she pulled into her driveway, Megan stepped out of her car and stood in front of her house, taking in the sight of her garden. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors vibrant and full of life. For the first time in months, Megan felt like she could breathe again. She had faced down a corrupt system and won, and while the scars of the battle would take time to heal, Megan knew she had reclaimed more than just her garden. She had reclaimed her dignity, her home, and her voice. With every step she took through the familiar paths of her garden, she felt the weight of the past months lifting. The fight had been brutal, but the result was worth it. Her flowers were still standing, a testament to resilience, and now so was she. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of changes for Megan. The board's defeat had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, and their reputation was in ruins. Henry Brown resigned almost immediately, his smug confidence replaced by a silence that spoke volumes. Linda Cartwright attempted to hold on to her position, but the independent audit ordered by the judge quickly uncovered more financial irregularities, forcing her to step down as well. The rest of the board members followed, leaving the community in disarray. For Megan, the victory was bittersweet. She had won the battle and secured the compensation she deserved, but the emotional toll lingered. The months of harassment, isolation, and constant stress had left her drained. Her son, Alex, had been particularly affected, retreating into himself as the conflict escalated. Megan knew they both needed time to heal, and she was determined to rebuild the sense of safety and stability they had lost. The first step was reclaiming her garden. With the legal battle behind her, Megan threw herself into restoring her beloved sanctuary. The damaged flower beds were replanted with care, and new solar lights were installed, casting a warm, inviting glow over the yard. Neighbors who had once avoided her began stopping by to offer apologies and support. Carol, her elderly neighbor, brought over a basket of homemade cookies, tears in her eyes as she said, "You showed them, Megan. You stood up for all of us." Megan's fight had sparked something in the community. Other residents who had been silently enduring similar harassment began coming forward, sharing their own stories of unjust fines and intimidation. Megan, now seen as a symbol of resistance, became an unexpected leader in the neighborhood's efforts to rebuild. When the dust settled, the community voted to form a new board, one that prioritized fairness and transparency. Megan was asked to join the board as a consultant, but she declined, knowing she needed to focus on her family and her business. Instead, she channeled her energy into something bigger. With part of the settlement money, Megan partnered with local environmental groups to create a community garden on an empty lot nearby. The project quickly became a hub for neighbors who worked together to plant flowers, vegetables, and even a small butterfly habitat. For Megan, it was a way to turn her ordeal into something positive, a reminder that beauty and resilience could thrive, even in the face of adversity. One afternoon, as Megan watered the rows of bright wildflowers in the community garden, Alex joined her, a rare smile on his face. "It's kind of cool what you did," he said, kicking at the dirt with his sneaker. "You didn't just fight back, you made everything better." Megan looked at her son, her heart swelling with pride. "We made it better," she corrected. Life didn't return to normal overnight, but Megan found solace in the small victories. The tension in the neighborhood eased, and she no longer felt the watchful eyes of judgment on her every move. Her garden once again became a source of joy, not just for her, but for the entire community. As the sun set one evening, Megan sat on her porch, sipping a cup of tea and watching the golden light dance across her flowers. She thought of the months of struggle and how close she had come to giving up. But looking out at the vibrant blooms and hearing the faint laughter of children playing in the community garden, she knew it had all been worth it. Her garden was more than just a collection of plants. It was a testament to her determination, her creativity, and her unwillingness to be silenced. And as the stars began to twinkle above, Megan allowed herself to finally feel at peace. She had fought for her home, for her family, and for what was right. And she had won.